Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Now, there have been a number of suspected and confirmed anthrax infections reported out of China recently. This includes at least one case of anthrax pneumonia, and more recently, a 14-year-old boy died from anthrax. And we've also seen some cases out of Russia and Kazakhstan in recent weeks. So, what is anthrax? How do animals and people get it? And what is this dark bioterrorism history? Well, joining me today to look at this serious bacterial pathogen is Stephen Berger, MD. Dr. Berger is the co-founder of GIDEON Informatics, that's Global Infectious Diseases and Epidemiology Network, and he's the Emeritus Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of Tel Aviv School of Medicine. Dr. Berger, welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so glad to have you back. So, Dr. Berger, what's anthrax? Where is it normally found?
That's an easy one. It's found everywhere.
Yeah.
Anthrax is an old disease. There are those who think it was one of the biblical plagues, which would put it around 1200 BC. And there's no way to tell if the cases that were seen over all those years were really anthrax or something like it, but periodically there would be many animals in a specific place would die of a mysterious disease, and they'd have blood in their mouth, which is rather characteristic. I'll get back to that later. And down through the years, it was with us, whether we knew it or not. It clearly was with us. Up until the 1860s, when a man named Robert Koch, and those in the field know his name,
Yep.
It was one of the first diseases he actually worked out. It was one of the first diseases that anyone worked out, where they found a specific organism and said, this is the cause of a specific disease. And that disease was anthrax. This goes back to about 1863 or so. Anthrax is caused by a bacteria. The name of the germ is Bacillus anthracis. And the name itself is kind of interesting because it tells you what the disease is. If you were a coal miner, you got the hint already. Because coal miners know that there's something called hard coal and soft coal. This is real trivia. But the hard coal that comes out of the ground is called anthracite. And it's not a coincidence that it's the same root name. Hard coal, when it burns, it's a black substance. And when it burns, it gets a red ember around it, just like the charcoal that you see in your barbecue. And the skin lesions of anthrax look exactly like that. People would look at the skin and say, whoa, that looks like a burning coal, which in fact it does. It's a disease, as I said, that's all over the world. When you ask where it really is all over. There is some evidence that there was anthrax at one point in Antarctica even. People claim to have isolated the actual organism from some old campsites in Antarctica. The disease, among other things, is it's a terrible disease if you get it, if you get sick. But it turns out that most people who get it either don't know they've had it or have a mild disease. And again, I'll get into some of this perhaps later. You mentioned the cases in China, but I think a lot of people don't know it's also in the United States. And as we speak, there are cases in Texas periodically among cattle and elk. And there were just some cases in Montana, Oklahoma, which for many years didn't have any, but it can occur anywhere. And the reason for this is the organism itself. Anthrax, the Bacillus anthracis, is a rather simple kind of organism. Simple meaning it sits in the soil, minding its own business essentially for sometimes up to years. If the weather gets bad or if it's dry or cold, that organism turns into something called a spore. A spore is sort of a hibernating bacteria. It has no water in it. It doesn't do anything. And that spore can persist for decades and maybe hundreds of years. There are those who think that it could come out after hundreds of years of hibernation. I'm saying hibernation in quote because it's not exactly an animal. And the thing that makes it come out of hibernation is often that it gets into you. And that's where our drama starts here today. It gets into your skin or your lungs or other parts of your body, usually causing just the skin lesion, what I talked about before, the burning coal in the skin, which again is a black lesion with some redness around it. It's swollen. Swelling is one of the features of anthrax. And strangely enough, it doesn't hurt. After having said this is a terrible thing and it's going to do things to you, it's an itchy lesion. And for that reason, people may not pay that much attention to it. If it's black and red, you may have a cosmetic problem. Certainly, if it's on your face or it's something you can see, you would run to the doctor. But not always that terrible looking. And that's in a nutshell what anthrax does.
All right. So well, we know it's in the environment. It's highly resistant because it's a spore former, and animals pick it up. Is this typically the way people get it, is via animals?
Yes, almost always. And the process of getting it can be, the process of getting it essentially determines what's going to happen to you. But if you get it because you touched animals or animal products, you'll get it in the skin where you touched. There are many, many outbreaks going through history, including in the United States, where people would process imported wool. There was an outbreak over 100 years ago in the States where you were getting bales of wool and you're working with your hands, and so you get the anthrax on your hands. And in fact, one of the nicknames for anthrax is wool sorter's disease. It was very well known in Europe as well. I got to see pictures of a case. I didn't see the case, but there were pictures of a case where some bales of Pakistani wool came into Boston Harbor, and it was up there those years. People were carrying the bales of wool on there over this part of your body, and they, strangely enough, would get their anthrax here. And it was, whoa, this is not a disease of Boston, but there we are. And down through the years, that's how you get it. The question was, how do you get it? You get it from touching the animal, or by eating the meat of the animal. Again, it's animal meaning mammals, by the way. It can be any mammal. There were outbreaks in hippopotami, and there are outbreaks in buffaloes, and anything you can name, essentially. Right. So if you eat the animal, you really can get into trouble, because that lesion, that black hole, is now not on your skin, it's down inside of you, and that can do terrible things to you. So there's ingestion anthrax. You can inhale the organism, and we'll get into that perhaps later too, because there are ways it can be delivered into your respiratory tract. And it brings up there are people out there who want to do that. So we get into an issue of bioterrorism. Right. It can be rubbed into the eye. It could be stuck in the back of the throat as you swallow it. But the major points for entry of the organism, again, are the skin, the lungs, and the gastrointestinal tract.
Okay, so we went over all these different ways that people can get it. If I had anthrax, could you get it for me?
Probably not. There may have been cases, there are anecdotal cases where someone shook hands with a guy with anthrax, but they're not well documented. I personally have not heard of a case, in my environment. I deal a lot with infectious disease and tropical disease in particular, meaning lots of other countries, but a person-to-person transmission, I don't think so. I mentioned you can get it by eating something, so theoretically a cannibal could get it. There are still places where that takes place, but we won't get into that particular subject.
Yeah.
I just as an aside, by the way, I counsel people going to Asia quite a bit, people who need shots for whatever country they're going to. And for several years, there was anthrax in the buffalo in Bangkok. Those of you who've been to Thailand, Bangkok is very popular with tourists. People running around Bangkok are walking around in short pants, as you can imagine. And the buffalo skins, in a very large percent in Bangkok, had anthrax. Luckily, there were no cases, but we all got a little worried about that for some years. We would tell people, don't ride those buffaloes in. So theoretically, it could be even from a thing like that.
Yeah, so earlier you mentioned inhalation, gastrointestinal, cutaneous. Can you kind of go over the different pathologies you would see and which ones are more dangerous than others, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, by virtue of essentially where it is, the skin is the least dangerous for obvious reasons, because it's in the skin. One thing that can happen with anthrax in the skin, or any other thing we'll mention, is that the organisms can go into the body. And this is true of any bacterial infection. It doesn't have to be anthrax. So in some percent, the bacteria are exposed to the blood, and they get into the blood, and then you're in some trouble. Then you get something called septicemic anthrax. Or it can go through the bloodstream to another organ. It can go to the spine, for example. There are several cases of anthrax meningitis, presumably because the organism went from the skin or some other place into the blood, into the spine. And things like that are not only severe clinically, but they're terrible to diagnose. Who would ever think of that? If someone came in with meningitis, the first thing on your mind would not be anthrax.
Right.
Or if someone comes with a terrible pneumonia or gastro, you wouldn't say, oh, of course, today you'd say coronavirus, you'd probably be right. But who would think of anthrax because someone has pneumonia? So there's that delay. And the delay can get, of course, the patient into great trouble, but it also there's a delay because the delay is dangerous because if you don't make the diagnosis, you're not going to treat it properly.
Yeah, it's really interesting as I listen to how you're describing anthrax. I recently talked to somebody from the CDC, did an interview about plague, and a lot of the stuff is very similar of the parts, right? I mean, inhalation and septicemic and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. And mammals, and the same animals essentially.
Yeah. How about treatment? Antibiotics. It's bacteria, so we're hoping antibiotics, right?
Yeah, antibiotics work. It's a very sensitive. That's another paradox, if you will. Plague also, by the way, plague, anything you throw at plague, they feel fine. They get up out of the bed. And that's a paradox because it's such a terrible disease. The same for anthrax. Anthrax, you have to get it early because it does progress very rapidly. So part of the treatment is when you start the treatment. That will determine whether the patient does well. But on paper, meaning the organism in the laboratory, if you put just about anything on that organism, it will die. Anything meaning penicillin, which is still a great drug for anthrax. Mm-hmm. There's a drug called ciprofloxacin, which is better in many ways, and it has become sort of the drug of choice. And again, lots of antibiotics, ciprofloxacin, some of you may know that drug, and things that are like ciprofloxacin work as well. So the answer to the question is just about everything you throw it will work. A treatment also includes something called immune globulin. As you may have heard also about corona, the corona infections, in many places, when you come in with corona, if you get it early, they will give you immune globulin. Globulin meaning the antibody of a person who went through the disease already will be injected into you. And it does work in some cases. That is still used for people who've been exposed to anthrax, the pulmonary form, because it gets right in there and you don't have much time to waste. And there's some evidence that it works. And there's even a vaccine. The vaccine is a problem. It has lots of side effects. And there were some issues in passing the FDA. I remember the American Army, at one point, they wanted to give me anthrax vaccine. I don't know if you went through that, but in Vietnam, they were, because Vietnam has a lot of anthrax, or it used to. Mm-hmm. And so we got sort of scared because we heard the rumors that it had side effects. But as a vaccine, it works. Aside from the side effects, it works.
Yeah. So other than the vaccine, which is, I know there was a lot of debate, there was a lot of protest among some militaries around the world. Other than the vaccine, preventively, it's basically what? Staying away from animals?
That's about it. If you're in a place that's a good point, by the way. It's an ounce of prevention is if you're dealing with places like Africa and Southeast Asia, and right now there's an outbreak in Turkey, which is sort of the same thing. I think the number one thing was don't pet animals. Don't get into a profession where you're dealing with large animals. By the way, for most of the outbreaks, meaning cattle, sheep, goats. If you're in that profession, you are at risk. There are places where they advocate vaccinating people in the profession, not just military, but that's never really taken off as an issue in most countries. They have the vaccine in some of these countries, but they don't use them. So yeah, that's right. Don't touch the animals. If you want to touch, I certainly tell your children and whoever's with you, you should be scared by what I'm saying. If you go to a zoo, well, you're probably okay. If you go to a zoo in Turkey or Tajikistan, I'd worry a bit about touching the animals. Yeah. There's no way to. I'm sorry. The animal itself, by the way, looks fine. The animals eventually do die of the disease.
Right.
And what's not known is in Africa, the animal that dies is eaten by another animal. He dies, and there's an outbreak among hippopotamus, which don't eat meat. That was sort of scary, but they had no problem eating, the hippopotamus, and there were outbreaks of a hippopotamus getting from eating a hippopotamus.
Yeah. Concerning the vaccine, though, is there a good vaccine for animals?
I think there are several. I don't have the animal vaccine in the material I'm dealing with, so I can't tell you. But I suspect there is. The human vaccine is good for only about a year. I don't know if that's the same as the animal vaccine, but you can see that as a sort of a bother if you're dealing with a herd of animals and you have to vaccinate them every year. But I don't know. I have no exposure to that literature.
Yeah. I threw you a vet question there. Sorry.
No, have you seen anything on that?
I think I've read different states when North Dakota, Texas, whatever, when they do have a case, they usually do discuss vaccinating your livestock.
Oh,
so I just didn't know how effective that was. Yeah.
no.
Now I want to get on to the real hot stuff, right? And we got Bacillus anthracis, sometimes used for very nefarious reasons over the decades as a bio warfare agent, bioterrorism agent. Dr. Berger, can you share with the audience this dark history?
Yeah, sadly I can. I think many in the audience will even remember it. Wasn't that long ago in 2001 where somebody was sending envelopes in the mail contaminated with anthrax. And people died. There were people who got the disease and died. And by when I say sending anthrax in envelopes, you can't just take it off the agar plate and put it in the envelope. Luckily for us, plain old anthrax out of the laboratory will probably not infect you. It has to be reduced to a specific size and a specific purity, and it has to, because that has to get through into the lungs. Plain old anthrax won't get from the soil down into the lungs. It doesn't work that way. So whoever did that had access, presumably, to laboratory equipment, and it was rather sophisticated. But you can buy anthrax. You can get the organism from a laboratory in most countries because you want to show it to your students, whatever it is. But it's not going to help you bioterror-wise. You still have to process it. Having said that, there was that outbreak in 2001, which was very scary. And because not only was it scary in itself, but the envelopes were going where they're going to congressmen, those who remember. So it obviously got very much out in the and then there was a few years before that, there was a cult in Japan called Angshan Rikyo, where a man went down into the subway and released anthrax. And luckily, nobody got infected. That man, a few people know, before he did anthrax, he tried Ebola. He went down to Africa to buy Ebola. And that was a little harder to buy. And it didn't work out. He just couldn't get it. And how would you spread Ebola? So, it's anthrax, you can see, it's kind of easy. It's a powder. But how would you keep it in your laboratory and then spread it without you getting, of course, into trouble? The first use of anthrax as a bioterrorism agent was actually in World War I in 1915, where the Germans tried to infect the horses and mules on their way to the States. I'm not sure if they intended on infecting people eventually, or the horses and mules themselves. In those days, of course, the horses and mules were the vehicles, right? They were, right, so it was kind of important just to get the horses and mules. And they sent some into Europe as well. In the beginning of World War II, in Japan in the 1930s, set up a unit for studying bioterrorism in Manchuria, and they would take human beings and give them anthrax and lots of other things. Just to, the question is, what happens if you give a guy anthrax? It's not the way you do research, hopefully, these days, but they considered it scientific research and had no problem with it. I think they'd never outlived the embarrassment of what they did. Lots of people died of the disease, also plague, by the way, and lots of other bad things. In 1943, the United States itself thought that they would develop anthrax as a bioterror agent for use during World War II. Of course, the war was going on in those days, but nothing was released. And there was an episode in 1979 that got a lot of press. There was a military facility in the Soviet Union in those days. A ship came by, and people on the ship got anthrax just by having passed that facility. I think people didn't know there was a military facility, but the wind was going the wrong way, and people on the ship were suddenly dying of anthrax. Of course, had it not been for that ship, nobody would have known. And it turned out Russia was very actively developing anthrax as a bioterror agent in that specific place. So you can see it happening. And again, anthrax, there are rumors about China, by the way, which of COVID right now. I doubt if they were developing. That comes up. That's why I mentioned it. It's not anthrax, it's COVID. But if it was being developed, I don't want to get into politics. If it was being developed as a bioterror agent, I don't know if they were just looking at the technology or actually looking to use it as a bioterror agent. But this is, again, as politics. So it's not just anthrax. Anthrax was, the more classic one. It's the one everybody knew about. Sad.
Right, well, yeah. So let me. So your organization, Global Infectious Diseases and Epidemiology Network, GIDEON. First of all, are these outbreaks, these cases that we're seeing in China and elsewhere, has that entered your radar?
Yeah, GIDEON follows all of the outbreaks, among many other things. It follows all the outbreaks in every country in the world in real time. I mentioned that Turkish outbreak this morning, among all those things I was talking about. It's already in GIDEON. That Turkish, I saw it on this morning. It's in GIDEON right now. And GIDEON has 35,000 outbreaks as of this morning. And of the 35,000, 750 or so are anthrax outbreaks. It's got all the outbreaks that are noted in the literature. In other words, if someone reports it locally and nobody talks about it, of course, we won't have it. But if it's in literature, be it health ministry reports or scientific publications or the internet, which is where I got this one, it's a good source on the internet. It will be in GIDEON.
Oh, good stuff. And is there anything else you want to talk about GIDEON? I mean, for the audience, you want to check them out. It's on GIDEON Online.
GIDEONonline.com.
And you can see that scrolling on the banner below. So if you want to check it out, it's a very interesting website. And I want to thank you, Dr. Stephen Berger.
Thank you so much
for all your expertise and your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Have a great day, sir.
You too.